Moving on to our other big story of the day, violence and protests have escalated in Sudan. At least 15 protesters, people were killed in the capital after Sudanese forces opened fire at them. This marks the bloodiest day of protests since the military takeover on October 25th. Security forces fired live rounds and tear gas at the anti-coup protesters. The latest deaths reportedly now take the overall death toll from the unrest to 39. Hundreds more have been wounded. Journalists in the country reported that people took to the streets across the capital, Khartoum, despite telephone lines and internet services being disrupted.
طلعنا الليلة نصرة للثورة ولإعادة المدنية لأن هذا انقلاب كامل الدسم والآن بدأ قطع النت والاتصالات.
The escalation in violence comes as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Africa. The aim is to boost efforts to resolve the deepening conflicts, not just in Sudan but also in Ethiopia. So far, U.S. diplomatic efforts have remained unsuccessful. Hundreds of activists and journalists have been arrested in a bid to stop the protests. The SPA, which is an umbrella of unions that was instrumental in overthrowing former military dictator Omar al-Bashir, called the crackdown a crime against humanity. Sudan's top General Burhan, responsible for the military takeover, has continued to insist that it was not a coup and promises that general elections will be held in 2023. For more on the ongoing situation in Sudan, our correspondent Patrick Oyet is now joining us live from Juba in South Sudan. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us. Now, we just showed our viewers what is now being called the bloodiest day of protest since the military takeover on October 25th. Tell us more about the ongoing violence.
Yeah, the ongoing violence is actually showing how frustrated the military in the Sudan are getting, because I think their calculation was that taking over the government and staying longer in power would frustrate the ordinary Sudanese people. They would get tired, fatigue would come in, and they would return to their own homes, and then the coup would therefore be normalized. This is not happening. The people of the Sudan are coming out in big number. They continue to say that they will protest until the military leaves power. They hand power over to the civilians, and they are saying they do not fear. They do not fear General al-Burhan and all his forces. They are saying they protested and they removed a former field marshal, former President Omar al-Bashir from power, who had been in power for 29 years. They do not fear to remove al-Burhan, who is in power now for 2 years. So the killing, the violence being meted against the protesters is only emboldening them, because we are seeing now protests spreading across the country. It's not only in Khartoum, but in the eastern Sudan, in Port Sudan, in other parts of Sudan. Protest is ongoing. So it is continuing despite the fact that the soldiers are trying now, the military are trying now to use force, to use live bullets, to shoot at the protesters, to kill some of them, but more and more people are still coming out and making that demand, a return to constitutional order,
right,
a return to civilian government. That is what is happening up to now.
Right. Patrick, also tell us about this development. The military chief, whom you just mentioned, has announced a sovereign council and has made himself the head of this council. How are the Sudanese people reacting to this development?
The civilians are rejecting. They are rejecting the nomination or the announcement of the Sovereign Council, because it was done unilaterally by General al-Burhan, who put himself as the head of that Sovereign Council. He put his close ally to be his deputy, a man who heads a paramilitary group known as Rapid Protection Force. They are known for violations of human rights in the Sudan. Sudan. They are men and women numbering about 150,000. He is headed by a man known as Doglo. He has put him as his deputy. Yes, he has gone ahead and put some civilians in that government. He has also appointed the armed groups, the heads of the armed groups, whom the previous government signed an agreement with. But some of those heads of armed groups that have been appointed have rejected to be part of the Sovereign Council. So that is not well received by the people of the Sudan. The people of the Sudan are saying they, first of all, want a return to the constitutional order, and then a government should be formed based on that, not a unilateral government formed by the military. So even that Sovereign Council, which perhaps the military thought was going to appease the people of Sudan to stop the protests, has never been accepted by the people of Sudan. Of course, this Sovereign Council also did not have politicians. It did not have members of the political parties. It had members representing various regions of the country, and still people are rejecting, the Sudanese people are rejecting that Sovereign Council.
Right. Patrick, my final question for you. How do you see this conflict resolving in the coming weeks, if at all? We know that the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Africa. Will U.S. intervention help at all?
Yes, there are options that the military can use. Option number one is what they are trying to use now, to stay as long as possible in power, try to make some movement as the one we have seen, appointing the Sovereign Council, to try to show that something is being done, make a promise, which promise the protesters are not accepting, and eventually they thinking that the protesters would go home and then the coup would be normalized. This option is not working well. Option number two is to return to the constitutional order, whereby it would require return of the Prime Minister to his position, handing over power to the civilian, and a new government be formed according to that constitutional order. That, to the military, it would look like a defeat. They are unlikely to take this option. Another option is, of course, to let things be as they are. That is not to use a lot of force, to let the people protest. But this option has a problem, because there are so many people in the Sudan who are having arms, who are all already armed, and they are having illegal arms. They are not authorized to be having weapons. Right. Now, this is going to likely ensure that non-state actors start being very active in other parts of the Sudan, such as in the eastern Sudan, around Port Sudan, in Darfur region, in Kordofan and Blue Nile, where so many people are having arms and they are not authorized. You have also the military groups that have not been fully integrated into the government, the armed groups. So this option is likely to create chaos. The only option now for the military, who, by the way, are finding themselves more and more isolated, is to listen to the voices of the people of Sudan and to ensure that there is constitutional order, an agreement is reached to end these protests, and the sooner the better for the Sudan and the region, because it affects also South Sudan, for example, that depends on oil, and the oil of South Sudan passes through Sudan. Thank you so much for all those inputs.
I'm afraid we're running out of time. Thank you so much for joining us on WION at this hour with all those inputs coming in from Sudan. WION World is One is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.